The gunshot that killed Thomas Nichols' wife didn't just shatter the morning silence over Fort McDowell, Arizona. It shattered everything he thought his life would be. Now, 3 months later in the summer of 1882, he stood in his ranch house kitchen staring at 4 pairs of eyes that looked up at him with the same confusion and hunger that twisted his gut every single day. "Papa, I'm hungry," 4-year-old Samuel said, his voice small. Thomas ran a hand through his dark hair, looking at the empty pot on the stove. He'd burned the beans again last night, and this morning there wasn't even coffee because he'd forgotten to buy more in town. His oldest, 10-year-old Margaret, stood by the wash basin trying to scrub a shirt that looked more gray than white. 7-year-old Joseph sat on the floor attempting to tie his own boots, the laces in hopeless knots. And 2-year-old Annie clung to his leg, her face smudged with dirt he didn't have time to wash off. "I know, son, just give me a minute." But there weren't enough minutes in the day. There weren't enough hands or hours or strength left in his body. The ranch needed tending. The cattle needed moving to better grazing land before the Arizona heat killed them. The fence line had 3 breaks he hadn't fixed, and these 4 children needed everything he didn't know how to give them. Margaret looked up at him with her mother's green eyes. "I can try to make breakfast, Papa." "No, sweetheart. You just focus on getting ready." He couldn't bear watching his 10-year-old daughter fail at tasks she shouldn't have to do. Couldn't bear seeing her small hands try to fill the impossible space her mother left behind. Thomas grabbed his hat and headed for the door. "Margaret, watch your brothers and sister. I'm going to town." He rode hard into Fort McDowell, the dust kicking up behind his horse as the sun climbed higher. The town was already bustling with activity, soldiers from the nearby military post mixing with ranchers and merchants. He needed to hire help. He tried 3 times before, but no woman wanted to come work for a widower with 4 children in the middle of Arizona territory. The last one had taken one look at his situation and laughed before walking away. Thomas hitched his horse outside the general store and nearly collided with someone coming around the corner. He grabbed the person's arms to steady them both and found himself looking into the most striking blue eyes he'd ever seen. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, releasing her. The woman stepped back, clutching a worn carpetbag to her chest. She was younger than him, maybe mid-20s, with dark blonde hair pulled back in a simple bun. Her dress had been mended in several places, and her boots were nearly worn through. But it was her eyes that caught him, those clear blue eyes that held both wariness and a fierce kind of determination. "My fault," she said softly. "I wasn't watching where I was going." Thomas tipped his hat and moved to go around her, but then he heard her stomach growl. She flushed red and pressed a hand to her middle, looking away in embarrassment. He hesitated, something stirring in his chest. Without thinking too hard about it, he spoke. "Have you eaten today, miss? That's none of your concern." Her voice was polite but firm. "Maybe not. But you look like you could use a meal and I could use the company. There's a restaurant just down the street." She studied him for a long moment, clearly weighing the offer against whatever caution she'd learned to carry. Finally, she nodded once. "All right, thank you." They walked to the small restaurant in silence. Thomas found them a table near the window and ordered coffee and breakfast for them both. The woman, who introduced herself as Diana Walsh, ate slowly at first as if trying to maintain dignity, but her hunger won out and she finished every bite. "When did you last eat?" Thomas asked gently. Diana set down her fork. "Yesterday morning. A woman gave me half a biscuit." "You're traveling alone." "I am now." She met his eyes. "My father died 2 weeks ago. We'd been living in a boarding house in Tucson, but when he passed, the landlord wanted me out. I had no money for rent, no family, nowhere to go." I thought maybe I could find work here, but everyone I've asked has turned me away." Thomas leaned back in his chair, studying her. There was no self-pity in her voice, just plain facts stated plainly. He appreciated that. "What kind of work are you looking for? Anything honest?" "I can cook, clean, tend gardens. I helped my father with his bookkeeping for years, so I can read and write and manage accounts. I'm not afraid of hard work." She paused. "But apparently I'm not what anyone is looking for." Thomas felt something shift in his chest, like a door opening that he'd thought was nailed shut. This woman needed work. He needed help. It was simple mathematics, except nothing about his situation was simple. "I have a proposition for you," he said slowly. "Hear me out before you answer." Diana's eyes narrowed slightly, and he saw her back straighten. He realized what she might be thinking and quickly raised a hand. "Nothing improper, I promise you that. I'm a widower with 4 children. I have a ranch outside town, good land, cattle, a solid house. But I can't do it all alone. The ranch is failing because I'm spending all my time trying to care for the children, and the children are suffering because I'm trying to save the ranch. I need help." "You need a housekeeper," Diana said carefully. "More than that. I need someone to run the household while I run the ranch. Someone to care for the children, teach them, feed them, keep them safe. Someone I can trust." He leaned forward. "I'm not proposing marriage. I'm proposing a business arrangement. You'd have your own room, a salary of $30 a month, all the food you can eat, and a safe place to live. In return, you'd manage the house and the children." Diana was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "Why would you offer this to a stranger?" "Because I'm desperate," Thomas said honestly. "And because you look like you need someone to give you a chance." "I'm not a perfect man, Miss Walsh. I'm exhausted and overwhelmed and half out of my mind trying to keep everything together. But I'm honest and I keep my word, and I would never harm you or treat you poorly. You'd be safe on my ranch, and you'd have work that matters." "4 children," Diana said softly. "Tell me about them." So Thomas did. He told her about Margaret, so serious and trying so hard to be grown up at 10 years old. About Joseph, wild and full of energy and constantly getting into trouble. About Samuel, quiet and sensitive, who still cried for his mother every night. About Annie, barely more than a baby who was starting to forget what her mother's face looked like. As he spoke, he watched Diana's expression change. The wariness didn't leave, but something else joined it. Compassion, maybe, or understanding. When he finished, she was quiet for another long moment. "I have conditions," she finally said. "Name them." "I want my own space, as you said, a lock on my door. I want your word as a gentleman that you'll respect my privacy and my person. I want Sundays off to attend church if I choose. And I want to be treated as an employee, not a servant. If you speak to me with disrespect or if the situation becomes untenable, I reserve the right to leave." Thomas nodded. "You have my word on all of it. And I'll add one more thing. If you come out to see the place and decide it won't work, I'll bring you back to town and give you $5 for your trouble." "Fair." Diana extended her hand across the table. "Fair." Her hand was small in his, but her grip was firm. Thomas felt something flutter in his chest that he quickly pushed down. This was business. This woman needed work, and he needed help. Nothing more. They rode out to the ranch in his wagon, Diana sitting stiffly beside him with her carpetbag on her lap. Thomas pointed out landmarks along the way, the mountains in the distance, the creek that ran through his property, the neighbor's ranch 5 miles south. Diana listened but said little, her eyes taking in everything. When they arrived at the house, Thomas helped her down from the wagon. The ranch house was single-story but sprawling, built from adobe with a wooden porch that wrapped around the front. It needed paint and repairs, but it was solid. Behind it stood the barn, the bunkhouse, and various outbuildings. "It's not fancy," Thomas said, "but it's sturdy." "It's more than I have," Diana replied. They went inside and Thomas called for the children. They appeared from various corners of the house, eyeing Diana with curiosity and suspicion. Margaret stepped forward first, positioning herself between Diana and her siblings in a gesture that was both protective and heartbreaking. "Children, this is Miss Walsh. She's going to help us for a while." "We don't need help," Margaret said quickly. "I can take care of everyone." Diana knelt down, bringing herself to Margaret's eye level. "I'm sure you can. I can see how hard you've been working. Your father told me how much you do around here." Margaret's expression flickered with surprise. He did, and he's very proud of you. But even the strongest people need help sometimes. I'm not here to replace anyone or take over. I'm here to make things a little easier, so you can be 10 years old again instead of having to be grown up all the time." Something in Margaret's face crumpled, and Thomas saw his daughter fighting tears. Diana reached out and gently squeezed Margaret's hand. "What if we help each other?" Diana suggested. "You can teach me about your family, about how things work here, and I'll help with the cooking and cleaning and looking after your brothers and sister." Margaret looked at Thomas, who nodded encouragingly. Finally, she nodded back at Diana. Joseph pushed forward. "Can you cook?" "Papa burns everything." "I can cook," Diana said with a small smile. "What's your favorite food?" "Fried chicken, mine too. Maybe we can make some soon." Samuel tugged on Thomas's sleeve. "Is she going to leave like Mama did?" The question hit Thomas like a punch to the gut. Diana's expression softened even more, and she looked up at Thomas as if asking permission. He nodded, not trusting his voice. Diana turned to Samuel. "I can't promise I'll be here forever, but I can promise that I won't leave without saying goodbye, and I won't leave unless I absolutely have to." "Is that fair?" Samuel thought about it, then nodded solemnly. Annie, still clinging to Thomas's leg, stared at Diana with wide eyes. Diana didn't try to approach her, just smiled gently and said, "Hello, Annie. That's a pretty dress you're wearing." Annie buried her face against Thomas's leg but peeked out at Diana with one eye. "All right," Thomas said, clearing his throat. "Let me show you around the house, Miss Walsh." He showed her the kitchen, which was a disaster of unwashed dishes and spilled flour. The sitting room, where toys and clothes were scattered across every surface. The children's rooms, where beds were unmade and chaos reigned. And finally, the room that would be hers, a small but clean space off the back of the house that had its own external door and, as promised, a lock. "It was meant to be a study," Thomas explained, "but I never used it. There's a bed, a dresser, a desk. I'll have Margaret bring you some linens." Diana set her carpet bag on the bed. "It's perfect. Thank you, Mr. Nichols, Thomas. If we're going to be living under the same roof, you should call me Thomas. Then you should call me Diana." He nodded and stepped back. "I'll leave you to settle in. Come to the kitchen when you're ready and we'll figure out dinner." Thomas left her there and returned to the chaos of his house. Margaret was trying to clean up the sitting room while Joseph chased Samuel around the furniture. Annie had found a corner and was playing with a rag doll that was missing an arm. He stood in the doorway, wondering if he'd just made the best decision of his life or the worst. An hour later, Diana emerged from her room wearing an apron she'd apparently brought with her. She surveyed the kitchen, rolled up her sleeves, and got to work. Thomas watched from the doorway as she cleaned and organized with efficient movements, occasionally asking Margaret where things belonged. She found supplies in the pantry he'd forgotten they had, and soon the smell of cooking food filled the house for the first time in weeks. That evening, they sat down to a dinner of beef stew and fresh biscuits. The children ate like they were starving, and Thomas realized they probably had been in a way. He'd been feeding them, but not like this. not with food that tasted like someone cared. "This is really good," Margaret said quietly. "Thank you," Diana replied. "Tomorrow, maybe you can help me make breakfast. I'd love to learn what everyone likes to eat." After dinner, Diana helped get the younger children ready for bed while Thomas and Margaret cleaned the kitchen. He kept glancing toward the children's rooms, hearing Diana's soft voice reading a bedtime story to Samuel and Annie. Joseph's laughter echoed down the hall. The house felt different somehow, less empty. When the children were finally asleep, Thomas found Diana in the kitchen making a list. "What's that?" he asked. "Things we need from town: flour, sugar, coffee, soap. Also, Annie needs new boots. Hers are too small, and Joseph's pants are all too short." Thomas rubbed the back of his neck. "I know, I keep meaning to take care of it." "You can't do everything," Diana said, not unkindly. "That's why I'm here. Make me a list of what you need to accomplish on the ranch, and I'll make sure the household runs smoothly so you can focus on that." Over the next weeks, a routine emerged. Thomas rose before dawn and worked the ranch, fixing fence lines, tending cattle, doing all the labor he'd been neglecting. Diana rose with him, making coffee and breakfast, packing him food for midday. She managed the children with a firm but gentle hand, teaching them lessons in reading and arithmetic, assigning chores, settling disputes. The house transformed from chaos to order. Meals appeared at regular times. Clothes were washed and mended. The children laughed more. Thomas found himself looking forward to coming back to the house each evening. He'd walk through the door to the smell of dinner cooking, to the sound of children's voices, to Diana standing at the stove with her sleeves rolled up and a smudge of flour on her cheek. She'd look up and smile, and something in his chest would tighten. He tried not to think about it too much. She was his employee. This was a business arrangement. But it was getting harder to remember that when he watched her braid Margaret's hair with patient fingers, or when he heard her singing softly while she worked, or when she laughed at something Joseph said, and the whole room seemed brighter. One evening, about 6 weeks after Diana arrived, Thomas was working on paperwork at the kitchen table while she cleaned up from dinner. The children were in bed, and the house was quiet except for the scratch of his pen and the soft sounds of Diana moving about. "Thomas." Diana's voice was hesitant. He looked up. "Yes, I wanted to thank you for taking a chance on me. I know you didn't have any reason to trust me, but you did anyway." She twisted the dish towel in her hands. "I'd been sleeping in an alley for 3 nights before we met. I was terrified and alone, and I didn't know what was going to happen to me. You saved my life." Thomas set down his pen. "You've more than earned your place here. I don't know what we'd do without you now. The children are wonderful. You've raised them well. Their mother raised them well. I'm just trying not to ruin what she built." Diana came and sat across from him at the table. "You're a good father, Thomas. You're overwhelmed, but you love them fiercely. They know that, do they? Because half the time I feel like I'm failing them. You're not. You're doing your best in an impossible situation." She paused. "Can I ask what happened to your wife?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. He didn't talk about this, hadn't talked about it to anyone since it happened. But something about Diana's steady presence made the words come easier. "Her name was Catherine. We met back in Missouri, married young, came out here to build a life. She was strong, stronger than me in a lot of ways. She could handle anything." He swallowed hard. 3 months ago, there was trouble with some drifters passing through. They came to the ranch looking to steal cattle. Catherine was outside with Joseph when they rode up. She told Joseph to run to the house, and she stood her ground with my rifle. The men laughed at her. One of them drew his gun and she shot him, but the other one was faster. Diana's hand covered her mouth. "Oh, Thomas, I was in the north pasture. I heard the shots and rode back as fast as I could, but it was too late. She died before I got there. The drifters were gone. The sheriff never found them." Thomas's voice cracked. She was 29 years old. "We were supposed to grow old together. I'm so sorry." The worst part is that the children saw it. Joseph saw everything. He doesn't talk about it, but I know he has nightmares. They all do. And I don't know how to help them because I can barely hold myself together. Diana reached across the table and took his hand. Her touch was warm and solid and real. "You're helping them by being here, by not giving up. They need you, and you're doing everything you can. That matters more than you know." Thomas looked at their joined hands, feeling something shift inside him. This wasn't supposed to happen. He wasn't supposed to feel this way, wasn't supposed to notice how Diana's eyes reflected the lamplight or how her touch made his heart beat faster. She was his employee. This was business. But his heart didn't seem to care about business arrangements. He pulled his hand back gently. "I should finish this paperwork." If Diana was hurt by his withdrawal, she didn't show it. She just nodded and stood. "Good night, Thomas." "Good night." The summer heat intensified, turning Fort McDowell into a furnace. Thomas worked longer hours, moving cattle to better water sources, repairing equipment that broke down in the heat. Diana kept the house cool and the children occupied, teaching them in the morning when it was bearable and letting them rest during the worst afternoon heat. Thomas caught himself watching her more often. The way she moved through the house like she'd always been there. The way she hummed while she worked. The way she'd tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear when she was concentrating. The way the children had come to love her. How Annie would climb into her lap for stories. How Samuel would seek her out when he was sad. How even Margaret had started to let down her guard and be a child again. He tried to maintain distance, tried to remember this was temporary, that Diana had her own life to live eventually. But it was getting harder when every evening felt like coming home to something he thought he'd lost forever. Not a replacement for Catherine. He could never replace her and wouldn't want to, but something new. Something that made him think maybe he could be happy again someday. One afternoon, Thomas came back to the house early because his horse had thrown a shoe. He walked in to find Diana in the sitting room, teaching all 4 children a song. She was clapping her hands to keep rhythm, and the children were laughing and trying to follow along. Annie was bouncing on her lap, completely delighted. Diana looked up and saw him, and her smile was so bright and genuine that Thomas felt his breath catch. In that moment, standing in the doorway of his home watching this woman who'd come into their lives like an answer to a prayer he hadn't known how to say, he realized he was falling in love with her. The realization terrified him. That evening, after the children were in bed, Thomas found Diana on the front porch watching the sunset. He sat down beside her, leaving a careful distance between them. "Beautiful evening," he said. "It is. I love this time of day when everything gets quiet and cool." They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then Thomas spoke, the words coming out before he could stop them. "Diana, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me." She turned to look at him. "Of course. Are you happy here? Truly happy? Or are you just making the best of the situation because you have nowhere else to go?" Diana considered the question carefully. "When I first came here, I was grateful for a safe place and steady work. But it's become more than that. I love the children. I love this house, this land, the life here. I'm happier than I've been in years, maybe ever." "Why do you ask?" Thomas struggled with what to say next. "Because I don't want you to feel trapped. I want you to know that if you ever want to leave, if you find something better or someone you want to build a life with, I won't stand in your way. You've given us so much, and I'll always be grateful for that." "Thomas, look at me." He did, and the intensity in her blue eyes nearly undid him. I'm not here because I feel trapped. I'm here because this is where I want to be. These children, this life, it means something to me. You mean something to me. The air between them charged with unspoken feelings. Thomas wanted to close the distance between them, wanted to pull her into his arms and tell her everything he was feeling, but fear held him back. Fear of betraying Catherine's memory, fear of ruining what they had, fear of opening his heart again only to lose someone else he loved. "I should check the barn," he said abruptly, standing. He walked away before she could respond, his heart pounding. He was a coward. But he wasn't ready, wasn't sure if he'd ever be ready. The next few days were awkward. Thomas threw himself into ranch work, coming back late and exhausted. Diana maintained her usual routine, but there was a new tension in the house. The children sensed it, growing quieter and more watchful. Finally, Margaret confronted him. She found him in the barn one evening, and she stood in the doorway with her hands on her hips in a gesture that reminded him so much of Catherine it hurt. "Papa, what's wrong between you and Diana?" "Nothing's wrong, sweetheart. Don't lie to me." "I'm not a baby. You've been avoiding her and she's been sad. Did you two have a fight?" Thomas sighed and sat down on a hay bale. "No, we didn't fight. It's complicated." Margaret came and sat beside him. "Is it because of Mama?" "What do you mean?" "I see the way you look at Diana. And I see the way she looks at you. I'm not blind, Papa." Margaret took his hand. "Mama's gone. I miss her every single day, and I know you do too, but she's not coming back. And Diana is here, and she makes us happy, and she makes you happy when you let her." "Margaret, you're too young to understand. I'm old enough to see that you're lonely. I'm old enough to see that Diana is good for us, good for you. I'm old enough to know that Mama would want you to be happy." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I don't want another Mama because I already had one and she was perfect, but I like Diana. I like her a lot. And if you pushed her away because you think you have to, that's stupid." Thomas pulled his daughter into a hug. "When did you get so wise?" "I've always been wise. You just don't pay attention." He laughed despite himself. "You're right. About all of it. I'm scared, Margaret. I'm scared of forgetting your mother, and I'm scared of loving someone and losing them again. You won't forget Mama. We won't let you. But Mama wouldn't want you to be alone forever just because you're scared." Margaret pulled back and looked at him seriously. "Diana might not wait forever, Papa. If you love her, you should tell her." That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his daughter's words echoing in his mind. Finally, he got up and walked through the quiet house. He found himself standing outside Diana's door, raising his hand to knock, then lowering it again. Before he could decide what to do, the door opened. Diana stood there in her nightgown and robe, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked surprised to see him. "Thomas, is something wrong?" "No, yes, I don't know." He ran a hand through his hair. "Can we talk?" She stepped aside and he entered her room. It was small, but she'd made it her own, with books on the shelf and wildflowers in a jar on the desk. They stood facing each other, the lamp casting soft shadows. "I've been an idiot," Thomas said. "What?" "The other night on the porch when you said I mean something to you. I walked away because I was scared, but I've been more scared these past few days thinking about what would happen if you left." Diana's expression softened. "Thomas, I'm not going anywhere. I'm in love with you." The words burst out of him. "I didn't want to be, I tried not to be, but I am. I'm in love with your kindness, and your strength, and the way you sing while you cook, and the way you braid Margaret's hair, and the way you make my children laugh. I'm in love with coming home to you every day, and I'm in love with the life we've built together, and I don't want it to be a business arrangement anymore." Diana's eyes were shining with tears. "What do you want it to be? Real? I want us to be real." He took a step closer. "I know it's fast. I know I come with complications. 4 of them to be exact. I know I'm still healing from losing Catherine, and I always will be in some ways. But if you'll have me, if you'll have all of us, I promise I'll spend every day trying to make you happy." Diana closed the distance between them, reaching up to cup his face with her hands. "You foolish man. I fell in love with you weeks ago. I fell in love with your dedication to your children, with your honesty, with the way you struggle through every day trying to do right by everyone. I fell in love with this family, and yes, I'll have you, I'll have all of you." Thomas kissed her then, gentle and questioning, and Diana kissed him back with all the feeling they'd been holding back. When they pulled apart, they were both smiling. "So what now?" Diana asked. "Now we do this right. I'm going to court you properly. Take you to dinner in town, buy you flowers, all the things you deserve. And when enough time has passed and everyone's ready, I'm going to ask you to marry me, and we're going to build a life together." "That sounds perfect." Over the following months, Fort McDowell watched the widower rancher court the woman who'd come to care for his children. Thomas took Diana to church socials and town dances. He brought her wildflowers from the fields and books from the traveling merchant. They took walks in the evening after the children were in bed, talking about everything and nothing. The children watched with delight as their father smiled more, laughed more, came back to life. When winter came and the Arizona desert turned cool, Thomas took Diana into town for dinner at the nicest restaurant Fort McDowell had to offer. After their meal, he took her hand across the table. "Diana Walsh, you came into my life when everything was falling apart. You brought light and hope and love back into this house. You've been a blessing to my children and to me. I know I asked you once before to make a deal with me, a business arrangement. Now I'm asking you to make a different kind of deal. Will you marry me?" Diana's smile was radiant. "Yes. 1,000 times yes." They married in the spring of 1883 in the small church in Fort McDowell with the children standing up beside them. Margaret held Annie and dabbed at her own tears. Joseph and Samuel stood tall and proud, wearing new suits Thomas had bought for the occasion. The whole town came to witness the wedding and celebrate afterward. That night, with Diana finally and truly his wife, Thomas held her close in the bedroom they now shared. "I never thought I could be this happy again," he whispered. "Neither did I," Diana replied. "When I met you that day in town, I was at the lowest point of my life. I thought I'd lost everything. But really, I was exactly where I needed to be to find everything I'd been looking for." "We saved each other," Thomas said. "We did." Life settled into a new rhythm. Diana was no longer the housekeeper, but the lady of the house, Thomas's partner in every way. Together they ran the ranch and raised the children. Margaret blossomed under Diana's guidance, growing into a confident young woman. Joseph's wild energy found focus in ranch work. Samuel came out of his shell, his nightmares fading as security and love surrounded him. Annie grew up calling Diana Mama, and Diana cherished every moment of it. 2 years after they married, Diana gave birth to a son they named Robert. Thomas held his newborn son and looked at Diana with wonder. "He's perfect," he said. "He is," Diana agreed, smiling tiredly. "Margaret's already planning how she's going to help take care of him." Thomas laughed. "She would." 18 months later, twin daughters arrived, Rose and Ruth, filling the house with even more chaos and joy. The older children doted on their younger siblings. Margaret, now 15, was a natural caretaker. Joseph, 12, was protective and proud. Samuel, 10, read stories to the babies. And Annie, 7, loved having sisters to play with. The ranch prospered under Thomas and Diana's combined efforts. Thomas's hard work and Diana's careful management of household finances allowed them to expand, buying more land and better cattle. They hired ranch hands to help with the work, Good men who Thomas trusted and Diana fed well. Fort McDowell grew too, becoming less of a rough frontier outpost and more of a real town. A school was built, and Diana made sure all the children attended. She became known in the community for her kindness, always willing to help a neighbor in need, always ready with food for a struggling family or comfort for someone in pain. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Thomas and Diana stood on their front porch watching the sunset, much like they had that evening years ago when everything changed between them. 7 children of various ages played in the yard, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. "Do you remember the day we met?" Diana asked, leaning against her husband. "Every detail. You were standing outside the general store looking lost and determined all at once. I thought you were the most striking woman I'd ever seen. I thought you were just being kind, buying a stranger breakfast." "I was being desperate," Thomas admitted with a laugh, "but also kind, mostly desperate though." Diana laughed too. "Best deal I ever made agreeing to come work for you. Best deal I ever made offering you the job. Changed everything." "It did." Diana looked up at him. "Are you happy, Thomas?" "Happier than I ever thought I could be after losing Catherine. She was my first love and I'll always carry her in my heart. But you're my second chance, my new beginning. You showed me that life goes on, that hearts can heal, that love can come again when you least expect it." "I love you," Diana said simply. "I love you too." Margaret called from the yard that dinner was ready. She'd helped cook it as a surprise for their anniversary. The family gathered around the large table that had been extended twice to accommodate everyone. Thomas looked around at the faces of his children, at his wife beside him, at the home they'd built together from broken pieces and desperate chances. He thought about that morning 5 years ago when he'd ridden into town not knowing how he'd survive another day. He thought about Diana standing on a street corner with everything she owned in a worn carpetbag. 2 desperate people who'd made a deal that changed everything. After dinner, when the children were finally in bed after much protest and excitement, Thomas and Diana sat together on their porch swing, wrapped in a blanket against the cool spring evening. "Tell me what you're thinking," Diana said softly. "I'm thinking about how much can change in 5 years. How everything can fall apart and come back together differently, better in some ways. I'm thinking about how grateful I am that I walked around that corner and literally ran into you." "Fate," Diana said with a smile. "Maybe. Or maybe just dumb luck. Either way, I'm thankful for it every single day." They sat in comfortable silence, the kind of silence that only comes with years of knowing someone completely. From inside the house came the sound of one of the twins crying, and Diana started to rise, but Thomas gently pulled her back down. "I'll get her. You rest." Thomas went inside and picked up little Rose, who was fussing in her cradle. He walked with her through the quiet house, rocking her gently until she settled. Through the window, he could see Diana still sitting on the porch, and beyond her the land that stretched out toward the horizon. His land. His home. His life. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was the life he had, and it was good. Better than good. It was full of love and laughter, of hard work and reward, of family and belonging. Rose fell back asleep in his arms, and Thomas carefully laid her back in the cradle. He checked on all the children, pulling blankets up and smoothing hair back, overwhelmed with love for each of them. Margaret in her room with a book still open on her chest, where she'd fallen asleep reading. Joseph sprawled across his bed like he'd been running even in his dreams. Samuel curled up tight with his favorite stuffed horse. Annie with her thumb in her mouth, a habit Diana was gently trying to break her of. Robert in the room he shared with the twins, sleeping peacefully. 7 children. His 4 and their 3. a ready-made family that had grown into something beautiful. Thomas returned to the porch and Diana. She smiled as he sat back down beside her. All quiet, for now, Diana laughed. It never lasts long with this crew. No, it doesn't, but I wouldn't change it for anything. They rocked gently in the swing, and Thomas thought about all the evenings ahead of them, all the sunsets they'd watched together, all the years still to come. There would be challenges, he knew. There always were, but they'd face them together the way they faced everything. Diana. Yes. Thank you for taking a chance on a desperate cowboy with 4 kids and no help. She turned to kiss him gently. Thank you for taking a chance on a homeless woman with nothing but a worn carpet bag and a lot of hope. We both got lucky that day. We did. The stars came out overhead, bright in the clear Arizona sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. The night air carried the scent of sage and dust and home. Thomas pulled Diana closer, and she rested her head on his shoulder. They sat like that for a long time. 2 people who'd found each other when they needed it most, who'd built a life and a love from nothing but necessity and hope. Inside the house, their children slept safely, growing up in a home filled with love and security. The ranch stretched out around them, prospering under their care. Fort McDowell continued its steady growth beyond their land. The world kept turning, bringing new days and new possibilities. But here, on this porch in this moment, everything was exactly as it should be. Thomas Nichols and Diana Walsh Nichols, together against whatever came next, bound by love and partnership and the unbreakable bonds of family. The deal they'd made that day in town had changed everything. Diana got a home, safety, purpose. Thomas got help, hope, a reason to keep going. But what they'd found was so much more. They'd found love in the midst of desperation, found family in the face of loneliness, found joy after grief. Years later, when the children were grown with families of their own, when Margaret ran her own boarding house in Phoenix and Joseph had his own ranch, and Samuel had become a teacher, and Annie had married a doctor, when Robert worked the ranch alongside his aging father, and the twins had grown into beautiful young women who could rope a steer as well as any man, Thomas and Diana would still sit on that porch swing and remember. They'd remember the day they met, 2 desperate people making a deal. They'd remember the awkward first weeks, the gradual friendship, the moment everything shifted into something more. They'd remember the challenges and the triumphs, the losses and the gains. They'd remember all of it, the whole beautiful complicated mess of a life they'd built together. But that was years away. For now, on this spring evening in 1888, with 5 years of marriage behind them and decades still ahead, they simply sat together in peace. The house was quiet, the children were safe, and the future stretched out full of promise. Thomas kissed the top of Diana's head. Ready to go inside, in a minute. It's such a beautiful night. So they stayed, wrapped in each other's arms, watching the stars wheel overhead and counting their blessings. A cowboy who'd had 4 kids and no help. A woman who'd had no home and nothing but hope. A deal that changed everything, and a love that would last forever. The end came peacefully for both of them decades later. Thomas at 82 and Diana at 79, within months of each other, as if neither could bear to be without the other for long. Their children gathered around, along with grandchildren and great-grandchildren, to lay them to rest side by side in the Fort McDowell cemetery, overlooking the land they'd loved. On their shared headstone, their children had inscribed, "Together they built a life from hope and necessity. Together they found love. Together always." But that was the distant future. The story that mattered was the one they lived every day, the story of 2 people who found each other when they needed it most and chose, every single day, to keep choosing each other. The story of a deal that became so much more. The story of love finding a way even in the harsh Arizona desert, even in the face of grief and loss, even when everything seemed impossible. Their story. Thomas and Diana. A cowboy and a woman with nothing. A deal that changed everything. A love that lasted forever.